morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here. Are we ready to roll? Okay. Romans chapter 3, we're going to do the first part of that this morning. I probably could have tried to do the whole chapter, but I think the end has so much that we'd like to talk about that I thought it'd be better to break this up a little bit, and we'll see how this progresses. Please remember that we're kind of in the middle. We're in the middle of a section leading up to 321, basically, a section where Paul is making the case that Jew and Gentile, that all need Jesus Christ, that all need the gospel that he's going to describe in these coming chapters. And so we spent time on chapter 2 last time, and we're going to hopefully finish up that section, getting us up to 321 today. Bow with me and let's have a prayer, please. Holy Father, we thank you so much for your word, for the glory and beauty of it 2,000 years ago, revealed by your Spirit to faithful men who transmitted it for us. And we pray that as we read, we will read in awe and in reverence and recognizing your wisdom there. Thankful for your wisdom there. Help us, Father, in our understanding that it might redound to your glory in Jesus Christ. In his name, amen. Several people studying or writing about Romans make the point, and we might have touched on it a little bit, but they make the point that a lot of times Paul is, sometimes they call it dialogue or diatribe, that he's putting arguments out there, what someone might say, how someone might react. He's voicing that. It's not always exactly clear, that he's doing that, but sometimes it is. And here in chapter 3, in the first part, I think we can see an example of that, where he's putting questions out there, either his own questions or questions he imagines that his readers or the hearers one day when they hear this letter read to them, that might come to their mind. And so sometimes it's maybe a little bit hard to tell exactly which one is speaking. I read commentators that said this first verse is Paul talking, and then the next one will say, no, this is the questioner talking. I don't know. It doesn't matter as long as we get the idea of what's he trying to bring out. He's trying to bring out what the reaction to his argument or to what he's saying here. So let's try to put ourselves in the mindset from chapter 2. Just remember, he had gone pretty specifically, pretty explicitly to talk about those Jews who were rejectors of Christ, those Jews who were unfaithful, those Jews who were proud, unrepentant, thinking they were lights in the world. And he quotes from Isaiah there in verse 24, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. So this is Paul making his case that even though the Jews some of them might look down on the Gentiles as beneath them, Paul said, you're really, if that's your mindset, you're really you're on the same level. You're on the same level. You're not any better off. And so this is really what leads into chapter 3, I believe. What advantage then has the Jew? Or what is the value of circumcision? Again, whether Paul is asking this or whether he's projecting, anticipating what somebody else might like, what advantage does the Jew have? He's taken them down a notch, in a sense, in what he's written so far. And I want to just emphasize, It's not that Paul hates them. It's not that he's blanketing all of them, and we'll talk about this more. He's not blanking them all, but he's saying there is a mindset. There are those Pharisees we talked about last time, those Pharisees in Jesus' day, the chief priests, the rulers. There's a mindset among the Jews that could tend toward this proud attitude, this idea we have the law. We're the chosen people. It's not unknown among Christians nowadays. We're the chosen people, so it must be right. The Church of Christ guy said it, so it must be right. You know, they had that kind of mindset, I think, that led them to reject Christ. So what's Paul's answer? What advantage does the Jew have?
The scriptures from the very beginning.
Yeah, they have a great advantage. I want you to notice the difference between here and verse 9. In this question, he says, what advantage does the Jew have? In verse 9, he says, well, is the Jew better? Does that mean you're better than everybody else? And it's very interesting the way he's arguing this, I think. Yes, they have a lot of blessings. In chapter 9, he will go into this in a lot of detail, all the blessings that the Jews had. But here he just touches on, first of all, they have the oracles of God. And I want you to just notice, it was entrusted to them. The oracles of God were entrusted to them. What does that bring to your mind? Why would he say it that way? It was entrusted to them.
Obligation.
Yeah, obligation. They had to be what? They had to be trustworthy. If someone is entrusted something to you to deliver it, then your number one job is to deliver it and to be faithful in delivering it. And I think this is really what Paul is getting at here. The Jews were faithless. They were faithless. And again, not all of them, but the Jewish leaders of Jesus' day, they were faithless in what God really had entrusted them with.
God knew it, and God gave them the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah.
And good lesson that we needed this morning.
Yes, amen. And so Paul says, what if some were unfaithful? What if they were entrusted with it, but what if they were unfaithful? And he says, by the way, some. He says, what if some were unfaithful? Does their faithfulness nullify the faithfulness of God? You see, some of them might have said, well, God didn't carry through. God entrusted, God gave the promises to the Jews, promises to Abraham, promises to the Jews, the covenant to Moses, and it failed. It didn't do what God had wanted him to do. And Paul is trying to tell them, no, you're looking at this the wrong way. Does this nullify the faithfulness of God? By no means. Let God be true and every man a liar, though everyone is a liar. Why do you think Paul says this way? Let God be true and every man a liar.
He's showing the difference between man and God.
Pardon?
He's showing the difference between man and God.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The difference between man and God.
Human form is going to fail you if you're not.
Yes. Sometimes I've been guilty of quoting that passage, let God be true and every man a liar, but I really mean I'm true. What I'm trying to convince people is what I said is right. We have to be careful about this. What Paul is saying is God is just. God is faithful. God is righteous. God is true no matter what. No matter what comes, no matter how men might fail. And he quotes from, I believe this is from Psalm 51. Actually.
Do you think that maybe he puts it that way to say that just because now the gospel's offered to everyone doesn't negate the promise that he made in the beginning? It doesn't make the Jews less or the Gentiles better. Like, they were always the chosen people. why wouldn't they want everyone else to have it as well?
Absolutely. And of course, that's where he's going in the letter for sure. Think about it this way. If they were unfaithful, did God just, well, maybe in the next couple of verses we'll see more of this, but they're like, did God just change his mind and go in a different direction? Did he go to plan B? You know, a lot of people have this idea. He went to plan B. No. God is true. Let's think about this, and actually I think we'll come back to the point you made, but let's think about this quote from Psalm 51. This is when David is confessing his sin to God, and he pulls out this section, Paul does, that you may be justified in your words and prevail when you are judged. What does that mean? That you may be justified in your works, or in your words.
God will be shown to be right.
Yes, God will be shown to be right. God will be vindicated. God will be upheld. David is saying, I'm the one that's wrong. I confess my sin so that you're shown to be right. You're shown to be upright. You prevail when you judge, I think is the idea in the psalm itself. You prevail. You overcome when you judge. Paul is saying, I think here, if somebody judges him, he overcomes too. Either way. Verse 5, if our unrighteousness serves to show the righteousness of God, what shall we say? That God is unrighteous to inflict wrath? I speak in a human way. What's he saying there? If our unrighteousness serves to show the righteousness of God, remember he's thinking about all these arguments that people might have.
Somebody's asking a bunch of rhetorical questions.
Yes, and that's what a lot of people call this rhetorical teaching or something like that. That's right.
But he's loaded their minds, I think, loaded their minds to get them to think to something that he's fixing to go to.
Yes, yeah. Think about Brother Paul, go ahead.
I was going to say, what comes to my mind is he has the right to make a judgment on us for unfaithfulness. Where do we get off thinking he doesn't?
Yes, that's right. And think about this actually, go ahead.
I'm sorry.
It's all right.
Going back maybe when you moved on. You asked how does the unrighteousness show the righteousness of God? It's because he continually forgives us, even though we're undeserving. We're constantly unrighteous, and he is righteous continually.
Yes, and so a little bit later he says, where sin abounded, grace abounded more. And some people would twist this idea. Some people might want to twist this idea. Well, then let's sin. Remember chapter 6, shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? Think about this in terms of the death of Christ. The Jews were guilty, the Jewish leaders were guilty of crucifying Jesus. It was according to God's will. They were working the plan of God, and so they might say, well, what are you complaining about then? You know, they might say, if our unrighteousness, I'm not saying they're saying that here, but I'm saying that's a good illustration in my mind. If our unrighteousness accomplished the will of God, then what's he got to be angry about? And Paul, I think, is suggesting you miss the point. The righteousness of God, the goodness of God, the holiness of God, the Jews betrayed it. They betrayed that. Ben.
Sometimes it helps me to think in like simple examples, but an example that I would think of here is that if you think about a pure white piece of cloth that would represent God's pureness and holiness and his righteousness.
Yeah.
And what they're saying is, well, yeah, we're dirty clothes that you put up beside it, but because we're dirty, it makes the white look even better.
Yeah.
And so why not let us keep being dirty so that way he can be can be white. And what he's saying is, yeah, but God doesn't take any pleasure in your dirty.
Yeah, it's great. That's a great illustration. I heard another one that you made me think of. When a jeweler wants to show off his diamond in the best light, what does he do? Puts it on a black velvet, right? Because it makes the diamond stand out, you know. So I think that's a good illustration of that contrast. He says, how by no means, then how could God judge the world? In other words, that logic that unrighteousness, you know, shows the righteousness of God, by that logic, nobody would be judged. But if through my lie, God's truth abounds with his glory, I think this is a restating in a different way. If through my lie, God's truth abounds to his glory, why am I still being condemned as a sinner? And why not just do evil that good may come? And Paul says some people have accused me of teaching that. Some people slanderously accuse me of teaching, yeah, let's do evil that good may come. And of course, this comes up several times. And I think this is a good thing for us to think about. In Paul's gospel, it was such that people would twist it. People would twist it and try to use it against me. Oh, yeah, what you're saying is this. Have you ever had somebody do that to you? Try to make a point. Well, if that's true, then what you're saying is this. And they'll try to say something so bad that it just makes everybody give up and go home, you know. Well, some people were saying this about Paul's gospel, that it was just, well, the more sin, the more grace. Have at it. I wanted to make this point here, just think about in those few verses. And by the way, I believe 3 through 8, or maybe kind of a little bit of an aside from his main flow. Some people think that 3 through 8, just a little side argument about what people might say in response to what Paul is doing. But in those verses, we have those expressions: the faithfulness of God, let God be true, the righteousness of God, the truth of God. All of those mentioned in those few verses. And I think it helps us see something about God's righteousness. We talked about this at the first lesson or two, I think, but righteousness is the standing that one has in the eyes of another on the basis of faithfulness demonstrated in action. God's righteousness is demonstrated by his faithfulness, his being true to his promises, true to his teaching, true to his covenant. God's righteousness is demonstrated in that. It's according to truth, being true to one's commitments. This applies in God's case. It ought to apply in our case too, or when we know the righteousness of God, when the righteousness of God is realized in us, in Jesus. This is a good description of what it means. It's not the same thing as earning salvation by works accomplishment. It has to do with faithfulness to God demonstrated in action. Does that make sense? Maybe anybody have a comment about that? We're going to see this next week. Get into this a little bit more in depth when we talk about the last part of this chapter. So verse 9, what then? Are we better than they? Some of your versions say better off. I don't think that's the idea. The idea is, are we morally better? Are we elevated? We have advantages, Paul says. We have advantages because we had the oracles of God. But are we better than they? Are we in better condition morally, spiritually than they? Not at all. For we have previously charged both Jews and Greeks that they are all under sin. What might he mean by this? They are all under sin. By the way, it's interesting, although we've been talking about the idea of sin all this, beginning of Romans, this is the first time he really says the word, which kind of surprised me. We're all under sin. What would he mean by this?
Means we're in need of something.
Yes. We're all sinners. We are all under sin, generic sin. It's like sin is a power, right? Or a person or something like that. We are trapped under sin. He says Jew and Greek, trapped under sin. And he begins here a series of quotes from the Old Testament. And I really want us to spend a little bit of time on this because I think most of my life I didn't quite see what Paul was saying here in these verses. And I want to have a discussion about it because I still am not sure I see it exactly right. But the way it's read by many people, I would say the vast majority of Christians, the way it's read, it's saying there is no righteous man in the world. There's no righteous person in the world. And I want you to just think about, is that what Paul is really saying here? Is he saying Daniel wasn't righteous? Is he saying Abraham, Job? I don't think that's what he's talking about, but he's getting at something else that has to do with the attitude of the Jews that he's trying to cement. He's already dealt with the Gentiles in terms of their condemnation because of their sins, but now he's trying to deal with the Jews. Let's look at these verses quickly and then come back and talk about that a little bit and see what you think. So verses 10 through 12 are quoting from, quoting, I think in this case, from Psalm 14. The first few verses. There is none righteous, no, not one. Down at the last verse there's none who does good, no, not one. And for many in the religious world, this teaches original sin. Man is totally depraved, and there is no righteous person in the world. Let's go through some of these, a couple of them, and then come back and talk about that a little bit more if we could. Verse 13, their throat is an open tomb. With their tongues they practice deceit. The poison of asps is under their lips. The mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Destruction and misery are in their ways. The way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. All these quotes, mostly from the Psalms, one from Isaiah, talking about wicked people. Talking about wicked people. But I want you to notice something. Back to Psalm 14. Just as Paul quoted, and I think maybe he's quoting from the Septuagint version, but just as he quoted, but in verse 5 of that psalm, it says, God is with the generation of the righteous. They are in great terror because the wicked are in great terror because God is with the generation of the righteous. And if you read every one of these quotations, I believe every one of them, there might be one that I missed, but I believe every one of them mentions the righteous in addition to the wicked. It mentions God taking care of the righteous, even though it's showing a condemnation of the wicked, of the enemies of God. It's there in the context of each one of these Psalms. Psalm 36, the last one, no fear of God before his eyes. In verse 10, continue your steadfast love to those who know you and your righteousness to the upright of heart. So you see how he's, and we won't go through all of them, but he's tying this together that there were the wicked, and then those who were righteous before God, those who were faithful to God, those who trusted in God, that he was taking care of in these Psalms. So what do you think Paul might be getting at here? Why would he be quoting something that says there is none righteous, no, not one, or just selecting out about the wickedness? What's he trying to do you think? Go ahead.
I've always thought, at least, which you're making me think more, but I've always thought, at least, that his purpose here was to show them that having confidence just in having the law was not enough.
Yes.
That God's pronouncement of righteousness underneath the law of Moses was for those who obeyed him, but it wasn't because they kept it perfectly.
Absolutely. Could y'all hear what Ben was saying? I'll try to repeat it if I can. But Paul is working here to talk about the Jews who had the idea that because we have the law, we're the right people. We're the righteous people. We have the law, and so we're the chosen people, so we're the righteous ones. And Paul is citing this to say, no, under the law, people who had the law time and time again turned their backs on God and were the enemies of God, and they acted in wickedness. They acted in wickedness. He's not saying there was no righteous person on the earth at all. He's saying there were example after example that you could point to where the wickedness of the Jews, even though they had the law, was evident. It wasn't a matter of having kept the law sufficiently. It wasn't a matter of just having the law and therefore you're righteous, and it wasn't a matter of keeping the law to the point that you could be righteous. He's suggesting that the law did not insulate them from wickedness. And he's giving example after example after example. So when I think perhaps when the psalmist is saying there's none righteous, no, not one, he's talking about the enemies of God. He's talking about the wicked. There's none righteous among them. The people, as Ben said, the people who didn't obey God, the people who didn't put their faith in God and submit to him, they were unrighteous. And so I believe this is the idea here, that he's getting at not babies are all born in sin and every man is totally wicked and can't do anything righteous. He's trying to point out this failure of the law, to deliver them.
Verse 11 kind of pointed out they didn't seek God.
They didn't
They
seek.
were born
Yeah,
into,
yeah,
guess who he's talking to? People who are not seeking God.
That's right. And so Paul is trying to paint this picture about the need for Jesus Christ, about the need for all the world to come to Christ. For people like Abraham, for people that had the faith like Abraham, this wouldn't be a problem. They would come to Christ. They would submit to him. For people who were proud of their status as law holders or law keepers, this was trouble. Paul is saying you can't make it that way. So in verse 19, he's concluding this. Now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law so that every mouth might be stopped and the whole world may be held accountable to God. By the way, some of your versions, the older versions, say the whole world might be guilty. Some say held accountable. Some say, I believe there's subject to God's judgment. In the American Standard and Christian Standard, the whole world is subject to God's judgment. Nobody escapes the judgment of God. Just you Jews, especially because you have the law, you don't escape. You don't get a free ticket because you have the law. Every mouth may be stopped. What does that make you think of? when, you remember when Jesus was on trial? And he said something they thought he shouldn't have? Hit him across the mouth. What they were doing, they were rendering a judgment. Stop your mouth. Stop your mouth. Maybe that's kind of the idea here. Don't try to excuse yourself. You know, don't try to justify your rebellion against God by saying we got the law. We're the chosen people. Again, good advice for us, isn't it? Good advice for us. For by the works of the law, no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes the knowledge of sin. What do you think about this? By the works of the law, what would he mean, works of the law? Or I think it actually says works of law, but what's his point there?
I've been through the works of the law, the things they had to do in the law and stuff didn't bring salvation. The law brought sin in that they understood it.
Yes.
Before that, sin, they
Yeah.
didn't understand what sin was. Now they know.
Yeah, the law had a function, it had a purpose, and Paul's actually going to get into this in detail in chapter 5 and then especially in chapter 7. The law had a purpose, but keeping the law would not save you. Keeping the law no man could be saved by virtue of his law keeping. Maybe I should say it that way. Brother Howard?
I'm just thinking when you see that and you say it, you have to think about the Pharisees, and they're so meticulous in doing everything that was exactly right.
Absolutely.
They're the ones that, like you said.
Yep, Brother Howard talking about the Pharisees who exemplified this idea that by their pride in their law keeping, they were justified in their eyes while others were not.
I was just thinking about Galatians 3, referring to the law as the schoolmaster. That was the purpose of the law, to teach them, to get them ready for this justification that was coming through Christ.
Yes, and you know, it's amazing to me when I think about it how much time Paul spends on this in Romans. But I think it points up to us, he's thinking universally. He's thinking about taking the gospel to the whole world. And he's thinking about everywhere he goes, you're going to have Jewish opposition. You're going to have people who misunderstand what the purpose of the law was. You're going to have Christians who maybe are tempted or pressured to go back into the law, to go back into law keeping. All of this was going to work against Paul's spread of the gospel. And so he's really wanting the Christians in Rome to have this under their belt, you might say, to be well grounded in this, I think. Through the law comes the knowledge of sin. He will say later that sin the law made sin become exceedingly sinful, or made sin exceedingly sinful. In other words, it drove it home in your face. The law served that purpose. Based on law, we talked about this already. Based on law keeping, no one will be judged right. The law does not solve the problem. In fact, it brings it to the forefront. It highlights it. In some ways, the Jews whom God had chosen to bring salvation into the world, to bring Christ into the world, they also brought this awareness and underlining of sin and the need. The law served to highlight their failure, basically. And so instead of being proud of the law as their salvation, if they had trusted in God and used the law to help educate and channel them in a good way, they would have been much, much further along. And by the way, when Jesus came, they would be ready for him they would be ready to receive him. Yes?
If I'm not mistaken, as we see what he's written from chapter 1 up to this point, some of these Jews seem to have been kind of puffed up. And saying this, we're taking that away. You cannot, nothing you can do is gonna save you.
Yes,
There's nothing out there, there's no keeping the law perfect. We've already seen that.
yeah,
You know, circumcision is not gonna do it. It's not circumcision, it's the circumcision of the heart. You
yeah,
know, it's all these things that run through. I was saying this exactly like I thought in my head, but there's nothing those Jews could do to, in their human body, make it right.
uh-huh,
Because when you do that, you lose your holiness.
yep,
You lose it.
that's right.
We as Christians, when we read this, we need to keep that in mind.
Yeah,
When we speak to other people, we talk to other people, when we think, the moment we come across that what we've done is keeping the law, the new law, better than somebody else, we've lost our humility.
yeah. And so the idea, for those who couldn't hear what Keith was saying, the idea of humility, of penitence, of an attitude of submission to God was really the key here. And the Jews had this opposite, had this pride and this arrogance. I keep doing it with too broad a brush. Many of them, many of their leaders, many of the Jews had this outlook. Howard?
This section really makes you think about the two men that went to pray.
Yes.
It really just shows.
Yeah, very, very concrete, a clear example, isn't it? The Pharisee and the publican in Luke 18, going down to pray. Just a thought, is there a distinction between works of the law and obedience of faith? I think so. Well, I know so. This is what Paul is telling us. Works of the law not justified by works of the law. That doesn't mean you can be justified without obeying God, without trusting and obeying God. That's a very important point, and so many people have this mixed up in the way they approach Romans. You might say, well, Larry, you may have it mixed up. Let's talk about it and let's work on it. But I really think this is a key to seeing what's going on in Romans, that when Paul is speaking about not saved by works of the law, he's not negating obedience. He's incorporating it, but from a different standpoint, from a different, it's obedience, not being saved by earning, by merit, by law keeping, by checking off, my good outweighs my bad. It's not anything like that. It's the idea that in Christ, trusting submission to his will, he'll say, if that's what you're doing, you don't have anything to boast about. Chris?
I think probably, knowing who Paul's talking to, any Jews that would have been there and that would have been under the thought process of keeping the law. And he says, through the law comes knowledge of sin. The law itself told you what sin was. But once sin was committed, there was a reminder, time and time again. Because we know, when you look in Hebrews, the blood and bulls and goats
Yep.
didn't take away sin.
Yeah,
But now they have Christ here in front of them.
yeah.
And he came. The
Amen.
reminder from the old law was of
Yeah.
sin over and over and over again, shedding of blood that could not reconcile them fully.
Yeah, so that the Jews were not only not better off than the Gentiles, they maybe were worse off. Just looking at their own
Sinfulness.
bootstraps, you might say. Looking back to chapter 2, remember what he had said about the name of God's blasphemed among the Gentiles. This is not a blanket condemnation of all Jews. Moses, Samuel, go down the list and think of those faithful ones. This is his picture of the dilemma that the Jews find themselves in when they rely on keeping the law. Likewise, Romans 1, I don't think this is a blanket condemnation of every Gentile or every non-Jew. What about Job? You know, what about those faithful who were back there, you know, before the law or outside the law who were faithful to God? It's not a blanket condemnation. It's a picture of the need of all in the world to know Christ. I mean, this is what he's trying to build up to. So back to our little diagram, all men and women in need of the gospel. None can be justified based on their law keeping. It's too late. It's too late for that. You offend in one point, you're guilty of all. It needs a new approach, right? We need a different way of salvation. And this is what Paul is coming to. Now, apart from the law, the righteousness of God. So he's giving something else apart from the law for the Jew, also for the Greek, that would bring this solution. And the solution, interestingly, his first illustration of it is who? Abraham. Before the law. His first illustration of the principle of what he's trying to do, he goes back to Abraham. Okay, I think we'll stop there, and I'll just say as we close, he's painted this picture. Now, what to do? First of all, God could just consign everyone to hell, eternal punishment, and be done with it. Or he could forgive me and consign everybody else. Of course, that's not God, is it? That's not God. He could just let it all slide, just forget about it, just so you have a good time. Kiddos, just so you have a good time. No, this is not God. This is not God. He has a solution. He had a solution before the world began. Not plan B. He had a way of saving men before the world began. And it all comes, and it's true from the beginning of time, but it all comes to a head in Jesus Christ. It's all come to a reality, to a focal point, to a demonstration in the world, a demonstration in the flesh, brought to a point in Jesus Christ. So that's where we're going next week. I hope you'll be excited to read about that and to dig into that for a few chapters. Thank you for your attention this morning.